now is the moment. All right, my name is Sia, and I am welcome. Thank you everybody so much for being here. And I wanted to welcome you to the third in a series of discussions that we built around Yael Bridges' documentary, The Big Scary S Word, that's socialism. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the issues that the film raises around the question of economic democracy. This event is co-sponsored by the Democratic Socialists of America's Fund, Dissent magazine, the NYC-DSA Housing Working Group, and Housing Justice for All, In These Times magazine, Dollars and Cents, and the Sustainable Economies Law Center. I'm your moderator, so I'm going to be taking you through the discussion tonight. And I'm also going to be a panelist, so I'm going to answer some of the questions that y'all have and some of the questions we've prepared after we watch a short clip of the film. My name is Sia Weaver, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in Brooklyn, and I've worked as a tenant organizer, campaign researcher, and housing policy advocate in New York State for over 10 years. I'm from Rochester, New York, upstate New York, and I hold a master's degree in urban planning from NYU. And in addition to myself, I am really excited to introduce the other panelists for tonight's discussion on the big scary S word and economic democracy. So first I want to introduce Ricardo Samir Nunez. Ricardo is a worker cooperative ecosystem development specialist who supports cultural practices, policies, organizations, and systemic changes that allow opportunities for us to all build beyond the interlocking systems of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. He is currently the Director of Economic Democracy at the Sustainable Economies Law Center, where he co-coordinates educational programs, legal services, policy advocacy, and regional and national ecosystem development to restore human labor to a right relationship with people and planet. Ricardo is a board member of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives and an at-large board member at the California Center for Cooperative Development and the Southern California Focus on Cooperation. So drop a plus sign in the chat or like a little celebration emoji on your screen to welcome Ricardo tonight. We're really excited for him to be here and to hear from him. I'm also super excited to introduce to y'all my friend, Senator Jabari Brisport, who is a Democratic Socialist state senator and represents New York's 25th state Senate district here in Brooklyn. He's not my state senator, but I will forgive him for it, and we're working on it. Until becoming the first LGBTQ person of color to serve in New York's legislature, he was a public school math teacher. And Kali Akuno is a co-founder and co-director of Cooperation Jackson, which is one of the coolest organizations active fighting for economic democracy in this country. That's not in the script, I just said it because I know it's true. Kali served as the director of special projects and external funding at the mayoral administration of the late Chukwu Lumbumba of Jackson, Mississippi. He also served as a co-director of the U.S. Human Rights Network, the executive director of the People's Hurricane Relief Fund, PHRF, based in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and was a co-founder of the School of Social Justice and Community Development, public schools serving the academic needs of low-income, African-American, and Latinx communities in Oakland, California. And I want to shout out the staff tonight who are dropping the links for all of these cool orgs in the chat so that you can find out more and get involved, which is why we're all here tonight. So we are going to start before we hear from the panelists, after we watch the clip from the filmmaker of this amazing film. Yael Bridges is an Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker. She produced Left on Purpose, winner of the Audience Award at DOC NYC. She's also the director of productions at Inequality Media, who's been making viral videos that tackle the complex political issues and have gained over 100 million views since 2016. She lives in Oakland, California. So without further ado, I'm gonna pass it over to the tech support team, the amazing tech support team, who's gonna show us a little clip. Oh, and one more thing before we do that, I'm gonna ask all the panelists to turn off their video, and just to orient everyone to what we're going to do tonight, we're going to watch a clip of the movie. We're going to hear from Yael. Oh, actually, sorry. Yael's going to introduce the movie. We're going to watch the movie. And then we're going to do Q&A, some prepared questions, and we'll hear from some questions from the audience.
Okay, I'm introducing now.
I'm sorry.
Okay, great. No, happy to do whatever. My name is Yael, as you said. I live in Oakland, and I'm the director and producer of The Big Scary S Word, which is a documentary about the history and resurgence of socialism in the United States. And it's a film that I worked on for several years, and I am excited to be able to have this panel conversation with you guys about how, how we can fix the world, because there's a lot to work on. So we'll look at the clip now, and then I guess we'll take it from there.
Awesome, and I just wanted to make sure, give you a chance to answer it. What brought you to make this film about socialism in this historical moment, and why is it so important that we're doing this right now?
Sure. Well, there are many reasons why I started making this film. I've been working in political films for my whole professional career. And then I guess it seemed like several years ago, there was a real shift, right? There were millions of people who voted for Bernie Sanders in the 2016 primary who didn't know what socialism was. That was a word, they were like, oh, I don't know what this means, but I'm really into his policies. And that felt like a real shift, right? Like there were suddenly people that this word wasn't a huge turnoff. So I knew something was going on. And indeed, something was going on and is still happening right now. So the genesis was really like trying to figure out what was going on. What did this word mean for so many people that was either stigmatizing or really attractive? And then also my secret motive was just to get my parents away from saying, oh, I like these ideas, but it's unrealistic. Like we got to be practical, and voting for these socialist ideas isn't really practical. And so I wanted to make a film that you'd be able to say like, oh no, here, watch this. What you're saying, it doesn't actually. That's the thing that's impractical. It's not socialism. It's like anything but socialism. And yeah, so then here we are.
Here we are. Thank you. And thanks for sharing that. It's not even a secret motive, right? Everyone has a personal reason why they're coming to this work. And I'm really excited to be in this work with everyone on this panel and you as well. So let's take it away. We're gonna watch a little clip of this film, and we'll do some Q&A. And so please write down some questions before we go. Panelists, please turn off your videos and your mics, and let's do it.
Conventional businesses, they are legally required to maximize shareholder return. And if they are not doing that, then the shareholders can sue the board of directors or the CEO to get their profit. We need an entire shift of our economy, but a fundamental part of that is worker ownership. Once we have workers in control of the businesses that they are in every day, then they can start making different decisions about how those businesses are run.
The central feature of socialism and its difference from capitalism is you could organize the workplace democratically. We vote for mayors and governors and presidents, but we go to work 5 days a week. We cross the threshold into the factory, the office, or the store, and we cede all power to a tiny group of people whose names we often don't even know, who make the decisions that are in every way more crucial to our lives.
In the United States, there's somewhere between 400 and 600 worker cooperatives. There's a large proportion of worker cooperatives in the retail industry, so cafes, grocery stores. There's construction cooperatives. There's home care cooperatives, house cleaning cooperatives, research and design cooperatives. More participation from workers actually benefits the bottom line.
Every morning, about 30 minutes, no matter if I'm off or not, every day. Just kind of get the wrinkles out, crease the arms, make sure the collar is crisp. I'm a worker owner, so I am an employee, but I'm also an owner. It makes me more excited to work because I'm involved. How you? On my previous job before coming to work for Evergreen, I couldn't see a beginning and end to it. It was just come do a specific job and go home. Here, if you do so much work, you could drive up the profit. If you have so much profit at the end of your fiscal year, you get a check.
The genesis of Evergreen started with an economic development strategy initially to just create jobs. It was part of an attempt to lean on large enterprises who spend a lot of money each year on goods and services who are here to stay. There was something north of $2 billion a year being spent outside the state of Ohio, and in some cases outside the country. And so Evergreen was designed to give these larger businesses options to buy local.
Here, a co-op is it's a collective of people who democratically and collectively own our operating companies. Everybody has a share. Everybody has one vote.
Good afternoon.
Hello, everyone.
Oh, hello.
Most jobs wouldn't just share the financials with the employee. Here, as you see it from the top to the bottom.
Working in co-ops absolutely changes culture. It changes lives. Because you're sharing profits, you sort of share workload, you share responsibility. The culture shift is, hey, how can I be more helpful to this person working on either side of me?
By flattening out systems of governance, we can start to see a transformation in both the workplace itself and also the individuals themselves.
The foundation of the co-op's mission statement is to build wealth and, financial stability. I'm a first-time homeowner, thanks to Evergreen, and last month I just paid off the house, so I don't owe a mortgage anymore. I just pay yearly taxes.
When you're talking about the benefits of owning a business and creating more opportunity for more people to own businesses and to have control over their lives, if that's not American, I don't know what is.
Great. Welcome back, everybody. I want to invite the panelists to turn their videos back on. Okay, cool. How amazing and moving. So now we're going to go into part one of the panel discussion. We're really anxious to get to as many of your questions as possible. So we've asked the panelists to limit their responses to 3 to 5 minutes. We're going to wrap up part one of this section with our prepared questions by around 8:50. And then we're going to spend the remainder of the time with questions from the audience. So in order to ask questions, you can put them in the Q&A section of the chat. Please use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions to make sure that they come in for the Q&A function, not the chat function. So it looks a little different. There's a little box at the bottom that says Q&A. So please submit questions as they come to you during the discussion, and we'll make sure to collect those, and we're going to ask them at the end. Cool? So if you have any tech issues, feel free to drop in the chat and someone from the team will explain to you, but there's a little Q&A there at the bottom. All right, so we're going to take it away. So really, really beautiful clip and beautiful film overall. The clip begins with Ricardo, who's here tonight, explaining to us that under capitalism, conventional businesses are required to operate on the basis of making profit, rather than on the basis of accruing benefits to workers or the general public. As a result, he says that we need an entire shift of our economy. And a fundamental part of that shift is worker ownership over businesses. In the rest of the clip, various commenters touch on how this works both in theory and practice, and how it really changes people's lives. So, Ricardo, I want to start by asking you, and then I'll open it up to the rest of the panel. How and why worker cooperatives are a necessary step to move us beyond capitalism and towards true economic democracy.
Thanks, Sia. Yeah, that's a big question. So I'll just start wherever I start. So I think part of it is that, as you know, probably mostly leaning towards socialist or some type of left perspective from the folks who are here attending today. And I think for me, part of it is trying to figure out practical steps as we are moving towards that socialist future, or that more humanistic future. And so cooperatives, worker cooperatives, for me, that's my jam. And worker cooperatives provide a space for people to actually practice in a daily lived experience way, that deep democracy that I think we're all going to have to flex our muscles to be able to participate in a future society that is actually requiring a lot more participation from us. And so as we're looking at the future of labor, automation, climate catastrophe, and the lessons that we've learned from this past, or the pandemic that we're still in, is what are the lessons that we can learn from all of those pieces? And for me, cooperatives provide people a space to start stepping into that future, and also for us to start thinking about different ways of relating to the workplace, different ways of relating to innovations in automation. Why isn't it that instead of automation meaning that people are losing jobs and not able to support themselves or their families, but that automation provides people with more space to participate civically, or just to take a step back and recognize that for the majority of our history as human beings on this planet, this was not how we functioned, and it is literally and figuratively killing us. And so I think worker cooperatives allow us to start to practice these ways of being in relationship to each other, and really having to confront difficult conversations with each other and confront the contradictions that we're all swimming in our current society. So yeah, so that's a little bit about from my perspective, just how worker cooperatives provide that stepping stone. And this isn't even talking about other ways of decommodifying land and housing, and creating more just food systems, and all of those different pieces that are definitely part of an integrated whole. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Awesome, thank you. I want to call on Jabari next to share your thoughts.
Sure. I'll say that worker cooperatives offer an incredible stepping stone for many people who are just at the cusp of wanting to abolish capitalism or become anti-capitalist themselves. And I say that because before I was elected, I would often do workshops with DSA's Afro-Socialist, Socialist of Color Caucus, where we would go and speak with youth, various communities, Black and brown youth, and we would do a workshop over the life cycle of a Jordan sneaker. And we would pretend we would work with a theoretical $100 sneaker and assign them roles in the supply chain. Like, you are the Bangladeshi worker, you work at the docks, you work in customs, you are the CEO, you were marketing, so on and so forth. And as they started to learn how little of the sneaker, or the wealth of the sneaker, the wealth created goes to the workers itself, they would start to say something you might hear a lot, which is people saying you can never make any money working for someone else. And they would start to say, well, then we need to be the boss, right? Or, we need more Black-owned businesses and we need to be the boss. And then we could intercept and say, okay, well, how does that actually change the dynamic if you just replace one boss with another and you are the boss? And they would say, well, that's what it is, dog eat dog world. You are either the worker or you are the boss, which is kind of what capitalism makes people think, which is that it must be eat or be eaten, kill or be killed, that there are no other options. But we could bring up worker cooperatives, which they consistently had never heard about, and say, what if rather than worker-boss dynamic, you could cooperatively own and cooperatively make decisions. And we seeded that idea over and over again. And it's a very powerful way to just let people know that it is not, we don't need to live in the false dichotomy of capitalism of, I'm either the boss or the worker. There is something that's cooperative and collective.
That's an amazing story, and I really want to see that workshop. It sounds like it's really effective at bringing young people into socialism. Callie, do you want to share your thoughts with us?
Sure, I'll just try to pick up on a couple of things that's been said, and just add on to it if I can. And what I would say is that cooperatives are our school for day-to-day, minute-to-minute democracy, right? And if we want to really democratize society, and let's be clear, we don't live in a democracy. Like, most of us don't really understand what the democratic functioning and operations of society really entails. We call what we live in, or those who set up this settler colonial project call what we live in a democracy. But I think, as Rick so often puts it, Rick Wolf, where we spend either half or some of us, more than 2/3 of our life, we really don't have that much of a democratic say. We don't have a say at all, fundamentally. And if that is the fundamental basis by which society is reproducing itself, then we don't live in a democratic society. We just need to come to accept that. So how do we get there, right? It's not just going to be through the ballot box that we get there. We have to transform all the different relations of how we both reproduce ourselves and produce the goods and services that we need to survive in society. This is where worker co-ops, I think, play an essential role, right? In re-articulating how we understand ourselves in relationship to each other and understand our relationship to the material world, both of which we know have to fundamentally change if we're going to survive, if we're going to get rid of all of the bad habits and the bad practices and the bad system, which are destroying the ecosystem, which are destroying our community relations. And this is where I think we, on a practical level in our society, can start the democratic school of worker democracy at their point of production. But I think we need to be clear, and this may get into another point, worker cooperatives and cooperatives in general are necessary, but they aren't sufficient to get us to where we really need to go towards socialism. So they are a building block, but there's some other things that we're going to need to really move to the society of associated producers in a decommodified society, right? Because we have to recognize, as they currently kind of operate without the broader systems of support that Ricardo was speaking to, we're still basically within a worker co-op framework, still dealing with the commodified aspects of society. And we're going to have to go deeper and figure out how to do that collectively to get us to the next stage of where we need to go.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks so much for everybody's thoughts. I am not a worker cooperative person, but I'm still happy to be here tonight. I work in housing, and that's my field. And you just shared that people spend 2/3 of their life, right, in the workplace, in a place where they have no democratic control over what really happens there. The sad thing is that they spend the other third of their life in their house, and unless they're like a property owner, and a property owner free and clear of a mortgage, we also really don't have too much control over what happens there either. So our inability to control the resources that we earn at work, but also the land value of where we live, really hold us back from being able to have a full and functioning democracy, as Callie put it. And I also completely agree, right, that as it stands right now, the sort of limited examples of both worker cooperatives and things like community land trusts or limited equity cooperatives or housing cooperatives are still functioning in that same highly commodified market. So they're subject to some of the exact same constraints that a traditional business might look like. But I also want to just name that one of the reasons why we care so much about this is that the cooperatives and the cooperatives are how we're like creating the democratic structures that are necessary for the reforms that we want to win to be both effective because people believe in them and durable because people believe in them, right? So big public institutions that nobody believes in, that have no functioning democracy, or as Callie put it, people don't believe we live in a democracy. They don't believe in the public institutions that exist. They see the state as something that polices them, not as something that is abundant and caring for them, and something that they have control over how it makes decisions to allocate resources. That is a huge barrier to the world that we want to see. And so this fight for cooperatives, both in the workplace and at the home, is really important as a really important building block to sort of rebuilding trust in our democratic institutions and creating those democratic institutions in people's day-to-day lives. And we can't do anything without those. That's what we need in order to win socialism. So the next question I want to take from here is I want to ask the panelists to expand further and discuss how worker cooperatives, along with other economic reforms such as public banking, guaranteed work and housing, how are these necessary but not sufficient conditions for the economic transformation that we are seeking as socialists? So first I'm going to kick this one over to Jabari, and then we'll hear from Callie.
Yeah, sure. I would say one reason why cooperatives may be necessary but not sufficient is that, to me, socialism is about taking care of everyone. And well, that also includes those who cannot work because they are, old or differently abled, or they're too young to work. I'm in the state Senate in New York. I'm the chair of Children and Families, and I do a lot of legislation around childcare. But if we are truly going to build a robust society that works for everyone, in addition to democracy in the workplace, in our political arena, we need to ensure there are policies such as progressive taxation and universal policies that are able to affect everyone regardless of their employment status.
Cool. Thanks, Jabari. And Jabari is an amazing state senator in Brooklyn. I want to pass it over now to Callie.
Yeah, a lot to add on to that. Where to begin in the time we have, because I could talk about this one kind of all day long. But let me start here. I mean, building on the necessary but insufficient, one of the critical things that we have to really focus on is not just being a sector of the economy, right? A lot of the talk about cooperatives that, there's the kind of the cooperative sector, or there's the ESOP sector, or, et cetera. And that kind of divorces it from the larger question, if we kind of compartmentalize it, the larger question of worker self-organization and worker self-management that we have to get to, which then encompasses any and every workplace, whether it's a cooperative now or not. And the organizing that we have to do to get workers wherever they are, be they in a union or not unionized, or some form of a worker center or a migrant form of association. It is our critical task, I think, in this particular point, to get the co-op movement in tune and in line with all of the different workers, wherever it may be, to then try to cooperatize with the rest of society and to organize and try to push and encourage everybody to turn wherever they are working into a cooperative. That way, then we could associate with each other, confederate with each other, and then do a level of coordinated dialogue planning to work both within the needs of our communities, but also within the needs of the ecology, right? So that we don't overproduce, we don't produce things that are kind of superfluous to where we're at and where we need to go, that we can kind of from the bottom up start to really rationalize how we're going to tackle CO2 production, methane production, et cetera, and that we put this and subject it to democratic control, not to some kind of market response or market force, and those who control these kind of limited and controlled spaces, that we put that to a collective decision, right? But we could only do that if every single worker or the greatest number of workers are involved in some form of democratic organization where they can federate and make direct decisions about production, distribution, consumption, and reuse and recycling, right? Or repurposing. So this is a critical piece of why I think it is necessary for the totality of the socialist project to not just see ourselves as a sector, but to see ourselves as a piece of what it's going to take to reorganize all of society and move it towards democratic self-organization.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. And speaking just a little bit about, again, like the sort of housing cooperative sector, in New York, where I'm based, we have a lot of shared equity co-ops, limited equity co-ops where working class people live, and have an ownership stake in their housing. And they're separate from the sort of renter model, the rent stabilized model, the rent controlled model. They're separate from our public housing. But it's a small sector, it's a small component of the affordable housing universe. And that means that they are operating under the same exact constraints and using the same exact financing tools as much of the other housing. And it makes it harder to scale. It makes it feel riskier to policymakers. And, I think co-ops are incredibly important for sort of creating these democratic structures, but unless we can figure out how to scale them, unless we can set the terms on which we are willing to like get capital and operating subsidies for co-ops to function, so we don't have to play by the rules that are actually set by finance and not set by us ourselves, they're not going to really be able to provide affordable housing on much different terms than some of the existing affordable housing projects that we have. So that's maybe like a little bit wonky, but the reality is that co-ops are the ultimate thing that we need to create the democratic institutions that control our homes. But they need to be able to scale. And until they're scaling at the level that Callie is talking about, they are going to be facing some of the exact same problems that other affordable housing models or sort of worker ownership models are facing. You're going to struggle to get resources. You might in a co-op, and it pains me to say this, I don't want to say it. But if you're in a co-op, because it's harder for you to get access to financing because you're sort of working with sort of less access to resources, honestly, and in a more isolated model and a more isolated sector of the economy, it might be actually more important for you to pursue an eviction, because that eviction of one person is going to destabilize your entire cooperative at a level that might not be true to a sector that is bigger. One person doesn't matter as much. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue cooperatives. It actually means that we should pursue them more aggressively. It means that we need more of them so that the risks are mitigated and so that we can actually be running housing on our values with the worker and like people control over both the land resource and the housing resource and the sort of economic gains that come with owning land and housing in New York. But right now it's seen as too risky and it's seen as too different. And that's what we need to overcome in order to like build those institutions that we really have for this model to work. And it is, because it is so critical to get us into that future. So I will pass it to Ricardo to answer this question too.
Thanks. Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. And I think at least what I've seen and what I've heard, there's a great metaphor that I heard from Gopal Dayaneni, who was with the Movement Generation, and talking about how the pandemic created this zero gravity moment where everything was thrown up in the air. And so people are trying to figure out where to position things so that when they fall back down to earth, there's a new positionality, both with power, resources, et cetera. And so when I'm thinking about the barriers that Sia's talking about around financing, scaling, all of those pieces, I was seeing already an interest in different cooperative models, worker cooperatives from a perspective of the last financial crisis and trying to figure out how can we create more stability in our communities. I'm from California, so the housing crisis, how can we create more stable, long-term, permanently affordable, community-controlled housing? So there's more politicians who are looking to cooperative models and land trust as a way to mitigate that harm and create more stability. And this is all to say that I think that there is the contestable space for power has shifted, and our movements and our people, we need to be acting and working together in concert. And that doesn't mean that we have to always agree with each other. It doesn't even mean we have to agree on each other's strategies and tactics necessarily, or which one is more important than the other, but that they're all needed. And so we need to at least tolerate each other's different strategic frameworks when trying to take this step towards this future that we're all trying to build. And then to the piece around I don't know, about how is this not sufficient, et cetera, around these different models that we're talking about. Where I go with that is, what can we learn from places that have already scaled these models? You look at Mondragon Cooperatives in Spain, where they have tens of thousands of worker owners and hundreds of workplaces that are worker owned and controlled. What has happened there? Well, one of the criticisms there is that the worker owners and the Mondragon Cooperatives themselves kind of separated from the rest of the labor movement in Spain. And there's a critique that there's a labor aristocracy because you have this sort of bubble where these communities and corporations created the opportunities for the workers in their own communities, but then left and stepped out of the larger labor struggle. When we talk about housing cooperatives and land trusts, a lot of the way that those have been built have been sort of piecemeal and like individual houses and properties. And so how do we scale those things? Well, historically in the United States, housing cooperatives, when they expanded and scaled, it was because of federal funding and different mechanisms for creating permanently affordable housing, as opposed to now where most of it is tax incentives. So I think there's a lot of different ways that we are going to need to activate, mobilize, and contest for power, as well as organize on smaller scale, in smaller scale ways.
Thanks, Ricardo. And thanks for bringing in this current moment of the pandemic, where I think a lot of our assumptions about how society is supposed to operate have sort of been like thrown into disarray. It's been a really painful period and a period of, a lot of loss. But at the same time, we've seen a willingness for deep government intervention to reduce poverty. Biggest expansion of rental assistance in decades, the biggest expansion of direct cash subsidies to people in decades, the child tax credit, which I'm sure Jabari can talk more about, but it's just, an amazing cash transfer to folks. So there's just been a real willingness in the face of the pandemic to say, things actually don't have to be this way. And an opportunity for organizers who believe in a different system to push forward a different kind of relationship between resources, whether they're land or whether they're jobs and businesses, and the people who work in them. So in housing, we've really experienced that with the eviction moratorium, but there's lots of other examples too. So I wanted to sort of ask, how the current historical moment, particularly this pandemic, and also the evident impacts of climate change on every way that society is operating, how have they made it clear that capitalism is not capable of this kind of economic transformation that we and the planet need to survive, and what sort of opportunities have come up? So I'm going to start by asking Callie that.
Another one that we could talk all day about, just have a conversation.
All of this.
There's a couple of different things I think we need to really look at. Number one, I think the pandemic clearly demonstrated that some of these arguments about where the tech sector is and how dominant in the economy that it allegedly was were, I think, clearly demonstrated to be overstated, right, and overcooked. Now, that doesn't mean, at least in my view, that the tech sector is not becoming stronger. I think it is becoming profoundly strong. I actually agree with was it somebody Varufakul's arguments about them now structuring critical aspects of the market itself. I think that That is becoming true. But what we saw during the pandemic, if we looked at and we analyzed what didn't stop, right? At any juncture of the pandemic, what didn't stop? What sectors, couldn't quit, and who was literally forced to work during those conditions in order for society to function. So critical parts of agriculture never stopped. Critical part of meat packing and warehousing never stopped. Critical aspect of longshore work and transportation work never stopped. We saw, Amazon become even more dominant in the economy and ramp things up, and how this kind of logistics sector became much more critical and important. Now, I'm bringing all of these particular pieces up because these are all areas, in many respects, that I think, with a major combined fight between unions and co-ops, right, and worker center, we developed a comprehensive, diversified strategy. I agree with Ricardo on that point, right? Because I can tell you some things that may work in Mississippi may not work in New York, and vice versa, in terms of effective strategies to get to point A to point B. But if we can come up, I think, with a comprehensive strategy that combines the workers in this coherent way, on a state by state basis, on a regional basis, then on a national basis, I think we can do some critical transformation of the economy, drawing from the lessons and then the repositioning that has happened during the pandemic. And another thing, for me, I've been happy in this case to be, at least in the short term, proven wrong. And what do I mean by that? I was making some arguments, through a coalition vehicle that we helped put together called the People Strike, that capital's hands, the employer's hands, were going to be profoundly strengthened by how the pandemic was being managed by Donald Trump, right? And this whole forcing people back to work much sooner than what the situation actually required, and much sooner than what society could actually bear in terms of distributing resources. Like, we actually did have, you want to look at it, we had a mini experiment, maybe about a 6-month experiment, with a form of UBI, universal, basic income. It wasn't full blown, wasn't full throttled by any stretch of the imagination, and they did far more subsidizing the financial markets than they did us, at every juncture of the road. But there was a little experiment in that which demonstrated the capacity of the state to be able to roll out something such as this, and for it to be highly successful and meet many needs. And I think a part of that, not for the same reason that the right argues for it, but I think a part of that demonstrated that labor's hand, and a broad sense of, I wouldn't call it class consciousness, but a certain level of self-consciousness about our role in the economy has been stimulated and awakened. And now you have, let me make it practical. So like in Mississippi, we waged or at least I was involved in, it went on longer than that, but about a 10-year campaign to win, $15 an hour, right? The fight for 15. And we made a little noise here and there in the campaign, did some good organizing work. But the pandemic in a short year basically won a $15 an hour wage in Mississippi where 10 years of organizing could not, right? Because of the shortage that is taking place of many workers choosing their health and their family over coming in and being subjected to the pandemic is a real thing. And I think this is some critical lessons, organizing lessons, and lessons around the transformation of consciousness that we're really going to have to tap into, I think, if we're going to move a radical agenda forward and not just have it be subjected to spontaneity. So there's a lot of work that's going to have to go into that. I mean, and I'm trying to cover a lot in a short period of time. So excuse me for if I'm just touching on things and jumping on some other stuff, but there are a lot of lessons to be learned. I think both summarizing what's happened in the last year and a half and really doing an analysis of where our power lies, given the strategic leverage that we had and we employed at different points of time during the pandemic in the key areas of the economy that did not stop and could not stop.
Yeah, these questions are like really intense, and we could have a whole panel discussion about them. Thank you so much. I think that there's so many analogies to with the housing movement that I won't get into right now, but we can talk a bit more later in the discussion just about evictions and how we've been able to stop evictions during the pandemic in a way that we never really thought was possible before. The one thing I do want to say, right, is that once you give somebody something, it's really hard to take it away. So you give someone ownership over their land or their housing, or you give someone ownership over their business, or you say, hey, you can't be evicted because there's a public health crisis. And I know you can't pay rent, but we're not going to evict you anyway because housing is a human right. And it's really hard to take that away. Once the people know that when there's enough pressure, the government's going to intervene to protect their human rights, it's really hard to say, you know what, we're actually not going to do that anymore. They'll do it, but I think that there's been a way in which people have like awakened to the idea that we could have a more abundant approach to land and to resources than we've had historically. And I hope that there's like massive organizing opportunity in that. Ricardo, I want to go to you next on this question, and then Jabari, and then we'll go to the last question before we open it up for panelist discussion.
Sure, yeah. I think the one thing that comes to mind around this question, that capitalism is not capable of the kind of economic transformations that we need and the planet needs to survive. What it brings up for me is the policy work that we've been doing at the Sustainable Economies Law Center with others around the country, around pushing for more support for worker cooperatives, for housing cooperatives, for land trusts, for community-owned renewable energy, is that when we're in the meetings with politicians, they don't know what to do. Like, they are out of ideas. And it's not in a way of like, they're explicit now that the ideas, their traditional responses to all of these crises are not working. And so if you're in a space where you have a politician who's looking for these types of answers or looking for alternatives, we found that over the last few years, there's been city councils, state, at the state level and at the federal level, all of these different folks who are needing these answers and needing to connect with people who have some experience in either participating in them or supporting the development of them. So I think that's something that I've seen that's heartening for me. And that's, like Kali was saying, it's context based on the different strategies that you're going to employ. But in California, we've been successful in convincing in multiple cities, mostly in the Bay Area, but a couple in Southern California as well, to actually provide funding, small amounts for the city, but $100,000 or $200,000 over multiple years to start funding the conversion of existing workplaces to worker cooperatives. So like Sia was saying, when somebody has something, it's really hard to give it away. There's this metaphor that I think of, you have to give a wolf some meat if you want to take away the bone. And so that's like one of the things that we're trying to figure out is how do we shift these systems in a way that the wolves don't attack us as we're trying to do it. And at some point also we're probably just going to have to fight. So so that's what comes up for me with this question. Thanks, Sia.
Yeah, there's no way they're not going to fight us. They're definitely going to fight us. They just are. Even when you take a little bit, they fight back hard. Which, Jabari, I can tell you, I'm going to pass it to Jabari, and then we'll go on to our last question before opening it up to the audience.
Sure. So I would say in the political moment we have now, just looking at the responses and living through the pandemic, it's become more and more apparent for a lot more people how different the lives of the wealthy are. If I can speak to one example, being that with so many people during this pandemic losing their jobs or their livelihoods, losing access to food security or worried about being evicted, a lot of socialists and progressives, we put it front and center that the wealthy had increased their wealth, that billionaires had gotten billions of dollars, or actually nationwide over $1 trillion richer during the pandemic when everyone was supposedly struggling. And in New York, we pushed really hard on a big tax the rich and invest in our New York campaign, and specifically honing in that over and over again that New York's billionaires had increased their net worth by over $77 billion during the pandemic, while others had lost their jobs and their livelihoods. We were able to win massive new taxes on the wealthy to invest into working class social programs, billions of dollars, not anywhere near what we wanted. We were shooting for 50 billion, and I think we won 4.5, which was far from what we wanted, but also the largest increase in New York's history. So we're still proud of the work we did. I would say the other main distinction we saw between the lives of everyday New Yorkers and the wealthy is back when the pandemic was at its worst. I know it had different peaks in different parts of the country. In New York, in New York City, it was right at the beginning, like late March, April was the worst. And when the crap hit the fan, the wealthy just up and left and went to their second homes in Westchester or another state or wherever. And it made it very clear to us how they respond to threats, to existential threats, and how they respond to, I know climate change was mentioned earlier, how they respond to climate change when the sea levels rise, and they'll just pack up and leave and go to their second or third home in a safer spot. You know, we just came through Hurricane Ida, where, you know, some people in New York died because they were living in basement apartments that flooded. You know, the opposite experience of someone that was fine in their penthouse. So we've seen class struggle be a lot more sharpened in the sense of people understanding that the wealthy live very clearly different lives than we do, that are much safer, and that's been helpful for awakening people's consciousness. And then just going back to what Sia mentioned about just winning these protections from evictions, that was a working class battle from the housing movement and socialist legislators that said that if housing is indeed a human right, and this is a pandemic, then we have to guarantee people's right to stay in their homes, and we can't let people be evicted for reasons completely out of their control, which are a global pandemic and nearly everyone losing their jobs.
Thanks, Jabari. I'm ready to open it up to the audience. So the first question we want to have from the audience is, you know, after all of this, hearing about all this amazing work, everything that's going on across the country, what actions can organizers take to help make the necessary economic transformations that we've talked about a reality? How can someone get involved in fighting for economic democracy in their workplace or in their home today? Does anyone want to take a stab at answering that?
I can start. I would say if there's a union for you to join in your workspace, please join the union. If there is no union, start a union in your workplace. And if you are already in a union, get more involved, right? How can you get it more militant and ready for when the time being you may need to strike and withhold your labor in order to extract more from the boss? When everyone watching gets a chance to watch the full documentary, it's amazing. There's one part that really stuck with me, which said that in hand, the strongest advances in the labor movement only came alongside the strongest advances in the socialist movement. Or they had to work together in order to push it. And if we are going to see the changes away from capitalism, and we want to see labor and strengthening labor and unions are a big part of that.
Thanks, Jabari. Yael, thank you so much for making this film. And after hearing all of the questions that have come up, both in the chat, from the discussion tonight, from the 3 discussion series before this, are these the kinds of questions and conversations you hope that the film would raise about worker cooperatives, democratic socialism, economic transformation, and capitalism? Is this how you hoped audiences would respond to the film, and what are you hoping for?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in short, a dream come true. Sorry, I have a lot of sunlight beating down on me right now. But Yeah, I mean, you work on something for a long time in a basement by yourself, and you only hope for moments like these. And this conversation, I think, in particular, is really something. I mean, all of these topics are obviously really important to me, but in my specific industry, we're incredibly disorganized. There is not a union that is in documentary; it just actually doesn't exist. There's unions in Hollywood and for fiction films and TV shows and for documentary. It's just actually historically just like, my friend calls it a rich white man's hobby. And that is just deeply true. And it's a real problem. Who gets to tell these stories? And the people who tell the stories in the media that we consume are they're just rich people. That's who can afford to do it. And so it's just really hard to figure out how we can organize, how can we transform. And it's a thing that I think about a lot for my work. I was really lucky on this film that there is a production company that is a workaround co-op, Meerkat Media, out of New York, and they're dear friends of mine. And so, they were able to speak to, help me navigate specifically the waters of the co-op industry, and also just in general how to make sure we're doing everything equitably. There's so much unpaid labor in the film industry. I could just go on and on about how horrible my industry is. But so this topic in particular, like, I'm taking notes. It's the thing I've talked to Ricardo about. Like, how can I do this for my own work? Because, there isn't a union that I can join, unfortunately. Though it is a thing that we are working on, Documentary Producers Alliance. There's like tons of different people that we're trying to. So anyway, that's what I would have to say.
Awesome. And I want to give the other panelists a chance too to respond on that question of how can people get involved and what conversations should we be having and how does this film help raise those questions?
Want to go, Ricardo? I can pick up either way.
Go for it, brother.
Well, I support what Jabari said 100%. If that is not within your reach, get with some other like-minded folks and start doing organizing a co-op. Would be the second thing that I would suggest. But those shouldn't be posed as like juxtaposed to each other or somehow conflicting with each other. I know sometimes they're presented that way, but I think I would make a longer argument that that's the wrong way to present it. That co-ops and labor unions historically were conjoined with each other. Unfortunately, there's been a disconnect between the two since kind of the rise of the AFL-CIO and the Gompers kind of model of union organizing, but that's not one that we have to stick with. In fact, a lot of the troubles that organized labor is confronting, I think it would do well to kind of shift some of its focus. So that's a challenge to those in the audience who may be part of a labor union to start thinking about forming more union co-op partnerships and models as a transformative piece. But then there's some other practical things I think that many of us, and I mean many of us like in the millions, are already doing. But I think we're just at this juncture of the road failing to connect, to kind of aggregate their power and to give them political direction. So to make it practical and concrete, I think there are now millions of us who are doing some form of community gardening, right? Either for our own kind of pleasure or subsistence or some form of kind of market exchange. I think we need to expand that exponentially and to do it to the greatest extent possible in a planned manner in our communities to be able to meet the caloric needs and the first kind of survival needs, and then try to scale that up over time to be able to execute local programs of food sovereignty. But that needs to be connected, I would argue, to the deep mutual aid work, which is taking place, particularly since the pandemic, where folks are kind of joining each other kind of actually meet a need and a demand, right? Because one of the weaknesses of a lot of our mutual aid work, at least in this country, is that it is pretty much dependent in the long run upon charity, meaning you know, like some of the stuff we've been doing here the last couple of weeks, and now there's another storm coming through that more folks are coming up our way, trying to escape, you know, the conditions down south. But one of the things that our mutual aid work is still dependent upon going to Home Depot and going to Lowe's for many essential things. And the one thing that we are really drawing home to, like our own membership and our own base, is that now that we know that these hurricanes are now part of the new normal, and the 100-year storms are now becoming every year storms, that we have to step up our food production to, at the very least, be able to meet the need of those who are in need of some form of food security, that we are meeting that need through our own productive capacity and not having to go to Sam's Club, giving Walmart more money, or giving it to what's the other one? I can't remember. You know, the Costco, right? That we have the capacity to be able to produce and do our own level of food servicing at this stage of the game, how we've kind of emerged from the pandemic, that we should be thinking about how do we store up and save up to be able to provide mutual aid on that level, where we're not engaging in kind of a commodified production, but in direct aid and trade, you know, with other communities based upon our combined needs. So these are a number of different things that I think that we are already doing. We're, you know, since the pandemic, there's been mutual aid that has popped up all over the place. Some of it comes and goes, but millions of people have been involved in that. And we need to sit back and really reflect upon that and to start asking ourselves the question, how can we move from our small little groups, you know, to aggregate with a group that may be on the other side of Brooklyn or the other side of New York, right? Or upstate New York, you know, or in Massachusetts, or even down here, right? How do we create the value chains and the supply chains that are going to be necessary to re-articulate the economy? And it starts with us, I think, really analyzing what we're already doing and figuring out how to aggregate and politicize it. So part of the question may be interrogating what you're already doing and figuring out how to connect that with other efforts.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, and totally in favor of creating those statewide or regional networks of people who are interested in doing shared work, because it's hard to do things if you're just doing them on that hyper local level. Ricardo, I want to pass it to you, and then we've got a couple more questions too before we log off.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, I think part of what the documentary does very well is show that there's a lot of different opportunities and entry points for everyone based on your particular interest and passion. And just to pick up on the last point that Kali was saying, is investigate what you're doing already. Is if you're working in a nonprofit, there's no reason that you can't also democratize that workplace. Like, we're out here, nonprofits are out there trying to dismantle these systems of oppression, and then we are recreating them within our own workplaces. So looking at the nonprofit industrial complex and starting to figure out how can we subvert this system, at least on our each organizational level. So that's one thing. And we work with organizations around the country to actually do trainings and share resources and learnings around how can we democratize the nonprofit spaces. I think another thing that comes to mind, I saw somebody pop in a question about gig workers, and so much of the economy is moving towards this independent contractor gig worker space, is that there are gig cooperatives, or basically where all these independent contractors are coming together to create basically a shared brand where they can be owners of it, as opposed to giving that cut to Uber or TaskRabbit or these other platforms. So that's being created in different spaces, and the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives is actually working on incubating a particular type of gig cooperative that can provide some other support services to those workers. So that'll be coming in, I think, next year or something like that. So those are a few different ways. And the last thing, I'd be remiss if I didn't say this. If you know somebody who owns a business, if they're looking to retire, it's really difficult to be running that stuff. Like just tell them about cooperatives. Just like offer this as something for them as an opportunity. So if they're looking to sell, that they sell to their workers instead. And there's a host of organizations around the country who do that type of work to support those transitions. So yeah, well, that's some of the ways that you can get involved.
Thank you. You also should join DSA, join your local DSA chapter, and you should get organized with a tenant union in your building, which is really easy to do. Talk to your neighbors. DSA has a tenant organizing toolkit. I don't know that if I gave it to Dave, but if I didn't, I'll just make sure folks who are registered get it. You should organize a tenant union where you live. It's really a fun thing to do. Get to know your neighbors, fight back against your landlord. Maybe one day you could own the building yourselves. All right. So next question for the team. What role do unions play in building worker power to develop cooperative ownership and then hopefully move beyond that to socialism? I think we've touched on this a little bit tonight already about that relationship between unions and on cooperatives. But yeah, does any of our panelists want to take a stab at answering that question?
I would say that unions are great at building solidarity. And I only said that because someone gave me the answer of unions a few years ago when I said that so many of the socialists I know in the movement are nerds. And how do we get more non-nerds to be socialists? And they responded, well, unions. Obviously, teach somebody about solidarity and how you work together in the form of class struggle. And you may not call it class struggle. You may just understand that, the boss is making $1 and you're making a dime, and that's kind of messed up. But it builds class consciousness to have those unions. And in addition to that, it's great for unions to be in conversation with each other. DSA has done great work about strike solidarity. And even at times when I was a teacher, I joined, spoke on the picket lines of other unions to say in solidarity, we are workers together. And if you're getting a raw deal, that means I am getting a raw deal.
Yeah. Callie, Ricardo, Yael, you want to weigh in on this question of how unions and cooperatives complement each other?
Yael, did you want to touch on that? Like, no? Well, I think let's be real about the here and now, which is that they are not complementing each other to the greatest extent that they could and they should. So I think it's our job to start from the concrete and then move from there. One, I think we need to have a serious conversation with each other about how we need each other and that we're not going to advance without each other. At right now, I'm gonna commit one of the treasons that I hate, which is to talk about the co-op sector. So the co-op sector and organized labor, we are both too minuscule in our kind of organized form at present. I think to really exert the type of power that we should as a coherent force representing the working class. And that is an organizing question. It's an organizing challenge. And part of what we have to really, I think, have an open dialogue and engagement with a lot of the union leadership. And I make a distinction between the leadership and like rank and file members, in this case, that co-ops are not inherently co-opetition with them in their position, within the labor market in the greater economy. And that where we should be complementing each other is actually striving towards democratizing our workplaces, which means also striving for cooperative ownership. And that is where a critical piece of the struggle with the union leadership, I think, takes place, because sadly, many of them are see themselves in many regards as either an extension of the companies that they are with, right? That they have to kind of make certain concessions given the weakness of where they find themselves, now say relative to 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, to try to protect American jobs from overseas competition or other forms of competition, rather than trying to see and form bonds of unity between all workers wherever they are, to cut off capital's ability to manipulate us all in different forms and fashions. And we have to have a real honest dialogue with the union leadership, I think, about meeting that challenge. Now, at the same time, we need to be engaged in concrete, practical organizing drives and campaigns of mutual respect and mutual benefit with rank and file workers, right? So where they are engaged in struggle, we should be there. Those of us in the co-op sector, we should be there, engaging in solidarity and advancing, the best of our ideas about, let's not just argue for better wages and work conditions. Those are important, but let's not, let's raise the question about cooperativizing this place, right? Transforming its ownership. Like, let's put that on the agenda and the table. And I think we need to have a conversation that meets both ends, but it's going to require us and forces like DSA be very clear about engaging in that argument and engaging in that dialogue in an open and principled and democratic way, knowing that there's going to be some level of hostility that we will meet by certain forces. But I think we should be prepared to engage that, not back down from it, and recognize that this is one of the real arguments about, how we transform society, that we're not going to be able to skip over, that we're going to have to struggle through in order to get to where we want to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Any more thoughts on this question before we move on to the next one from the audience? And again, we've got until about 9:25 for questions. And I want to encourage folks to put questions in the chat. So we've got about 10 minutes left. So any pressing questions, put them in the chat.
I'll just say about the union co-op relationship piece is that one of the things that I'm seeing from my friends who are union organizers is the deep disillusion with a lot of union members, and actually being able, like, understanding what the union is doing, like the participation of members between contract negotiations, and that basically there's not really a lot of engagement. And so how do they democratize the unions themselves and create more participation from the members? And I think what cooperatives can do is be, if we can be in conversation with those folks, is we've learned a lot of lessons. We've made a lot of mistakes, and the unions don't need to make those same mistakes as they're trying to democratize and create more participatory structures for unions themselves. And I don't want to put all the blame on unions because this is structural. Like, the laws that have legalized unions and collective bargaining were created not to increase worker power. They were created to make the stream of commerce move effectively, like, forward. That's it. And so when you look at the Wagner Act and the National Labor Relations Board, the function of those things is not to build worker power. And so part of what worker cooperatives can do is provide the lessons that we've learned and be working in partnership with folks who are engaging members and trying to organize workplaces so that we can share the lessons that we've learned and be taking these steps down this path together.
All right, so I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. So the first one is, I want to know from y'all, how might a worker-owned co-op be financed on a large scale without relying on the private financial industry? And what might this financing ecology look like specifically? Who would make the financing decisions, and how would the co-op get access to the capital it needs to really thrive?
I can start with this one. So there's a lot of different ways that we can do this. The states that do have cooperative entities, like a legal cooperative entity for the state, typically have some cap on return for investment. So cooperatives can still have outside investors, but they have limited participation or voting rights, and they have a cap on the extraction of wealth from those workplaces. So that's one, is that individuals would still be able to invest in them. But also, like, looking at really innovative models, like the working world has created this project called the Seed Commons that are creating regional loan funds that are actually democratically controlled by community-based organizations around the country, and they decide what cooperatives to invest in. And so the working world provides seed capital, and then the investments happen in local cooperatives, and the money, the return that happens, can be reinvested. And so looking at how can we democratize finance and capital is going to be a necessary component for us to really move forward. On top of the policy work that folks around the country have been doing. I mean, New York City was one of the early big wins for investing in worker cooperatives, and seeing just an explosion of worker cooperative businesses and organizations in New York because of that city funding. So there's lots of different pathways and avenues. And those are just a few.
Well, thanks. Anyone else want to weigh in on this question?
I mean, one of the things that we've been struggling with on this question is unions. Actually, and really trying to impress upon some of our union allies that their various, kind of investment funds, because most unions have those, almost all unions have those, that they need to redirect a lot of those resources and invest them in the development, of things that they can own and control, and not just pour that money into financial markets, which are designed to actually undermine and weaken their power. That is a longer term argument by far. We've been trying to have this conversation now for 7 years with mixed returns, both on a local and a regional level. But it's one that for sure we're not going to give up on, because we for us, there's a political point around moving to where working people are financing our own endeavors. And this is not to be opposed to any other strategy, but there's a political point and a point around transforming our own consciousness that we are trying to endeavor here to get people to understand and to utilize, our collective power to be able to move what we want to move. And so it's one that I know we're going to continue pursuing, and I would encourage folks wherever you are, to engage in those conversations, along with the long-term strategy and development. Because look, I mean, from my vantage point, I don't think we leave any stone unturned, but the market and the forces of capital are not going to endow us with the resources to undermine them in the long term, right? They'll give us maybe enough room to breathe, to operate, to wiggle and struggle, but at some point, we're going to have to come to grips about us financing us, and what that is going to take, what type of sacrifices, what type of self-organization is that going to take to really make this move?
Yeah. All right. So one last question, and then we're going to close out. So for, over the last months, one of the strongest bargaining chips for higher wages was the refusal of folks to work during the pandemic because of health concerns, because of whatever concerns. And with unemployment benefits recently cut off just a week ago, how can we keep this momentum up in the face of such strong opposition and such strong need? How much greater and more violent will the capitalist reaction against serious advances towards socialism be? And what do you all expect? And where should we go from here? And again, this is our final question, so I'll ask each panelist to answer it. Try and take about a minute so we can close out and get everyone off here by 9:30. And I'll start with Jabari.
Sure, thank you. So I think while unemployment benefits were going. You got a chance for a lot of bosses and employers to reckon with the fact that they were not paying people enough. And maybe they didn't reckon it. Maybe they would put a sign on their windows saying no one wants to work anymore. I'm sure many of you have seen that photo. It's like some fast food agency says we can't hire any workers. No one wants to work anymore. And truly, no one wants to work for starvation wages anymore, especially when unemployment, was giving them enough benefits to survive. So there's that. I have been noticing, I've been seeing a lot of like articles and just trends of people looking for alternate work or just resigning, being fed up with, their life they had before COVID and before we had a massive shakeup. I think it is time to continue pushing for deeper wages. I think we can't let up on the fact that the wealthy have increased their wealth by over $1 trillion in the pandemic, because, whenever you hear pushback about, increasing in wages, harming businesses, that's simply not true, because wages have increased for the 1%. And they don't get wages per se, but their pay has increased for the 1%.
Jabari, Ricardo?
Sorry, can you say the question one more time? Because I'm just trying to wrap my head around everything you were saying, and then you said the question.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. With unemployment benefits recently cut off, how are we going to keep up this momentum against exploitative wage labor, basically? And what do we think opposition will look like? How is our opposition going to get more violent? And what should we do? What should we be doing now that there's no unemployment?
Yeah, I think one thing we should definitely be trying to figure out how to organize and come together and fight those types of reductions in relief. But I also think that one thing that the pandemic showed, particularly at the beginning, was the emergence of mutual aid networks, and just the fact that communities came together and took care of themselves, we take care of us. And so I think that's something that we can start to build on, those networks that were created, those relationships that were created, and figure out ways to use those relationships and networks to support this movement of fighting against these austerity cuts and other ways, neoliberal types of responses to our current conditions.
Yeah, it's been truly amazing. Thank you. Callie?
We have to take a lesson from the right on this. And I think that is politicizing the pandemic. I don't think we've done enough of that. I think we've been on the defensive relative to the pandemic. And I think we have to politicize it and make some real sharp and clear distinctions. Are we for health and humanity? Or are we just, for running the economy till we're all dead? I mean, because those are literally the two choices. And I think the right has been very clear about that. I mean, let's not forget that they were arguing this time last year that old folks should just sacrifice themselves for the economy, right? That people would, either because they were allegedly prepared to die, which no old people I know were prepared to die, or they were just going to be sacrificed. And clearly, there's a coherent strategy being pushed by, the right at the level of state governance. Florida, Texas, I think being kind of the tip of the spear in this regard. They are clearly following a herd immunity strategy at this point. They haven't called it that. I think their own focus groups and studies said back off that wording, but in policy, that is actually what they're moving forward. Hell, that actually might win their arguments. I don't think they're going to win in California, but the fact that they've gained as much traction as they have with this argument coming from Larry Elder should tell us something. And I think we have to politicize it back in and use that as a test case for look, let's make the arguments about the society we want, not just settle for the best that we can get, but we have to totally restructure society, with healthcare and healthy living being in the lead. And then what does that look like? How does that entail? How do we produce that? That is where I think we need to be leading this charge in this fight right now. And I think it will resonate even amongst forces amongst the right who are just being bewildered with misinformation, constant bombardment. I don't think we're doing a good enough job to really countering that, and leaving that up to MSNBC and CNN is not a winning ticket for us. So, we got to put in our work and do the grassroots work of politicizing this, and I think we'll have a much different outcome.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll leave the final word to you, then we're gonna out. And thanks everyone for joining.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I guess to pick up, I don't think we should be leaving anything to MSNBC or CNN. Yeah, so I can't really top that. I'm not feeling too hopeful these days, but I can say, just, if you are in film or documentary, please reach out to me, because I am actually doing and creating a working group around organizing, whether that's a co-op or something else is TBD. And you should go to socialismmovie.com, where you can find links to rent the film. We are doing community screenings with different organizations. We would love to come and speak to your organization. The people that are in the film would love to come and do a panel for you, with you. And yeah, I don't know. Thank you guys so much. I know that I learned a lot and was taking notes. So thank you guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. And I am at our time tonight is up. So that doesn't mean that the conversation is over. Please do reach out, as Yael mentioned. Go check out the film, reach out to any of our organizations to get involved. I also want to thank everyone who's involved in bringing this event together. Of course, Yael, the filmmaker, the big scary S word, my fellow panelists, our co-sponsors, our audience and discussants, and everyone. You will all be receiving follow-up emails about this event and other upcoming events you can get involved with and join. Thank you so much for your great questions and comments in the Q&A box. And thank you also to everyone on the YouTube and the Facebook Live and the Twitter and the blah, 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 who are watching, who we can't see them, but they are here. I want to thank Flynn Murray from Dissent Magazine, Sunshine, Michael, David, and Priscilla from the Democratic Socialists of America Fund. And, I know the panelists tonight have really given us all a lot to think about, and some clear direct actions we can take in our workplaces and in our homes to fight for economic democracy. We are. In the follow-up email to this event, which you will get if you registered, we'll include a link to the video, and that video will also be on the DSA Fund YouTube channel, which you can subscribe to. So subscribe to the YouTube channel, share that video widely, and please do get involved in some local opportunities for action that everyone spoke about tonight. Organize your workplace, form a cooperative, organize your home, and have a good night. Thanks everybody so much for joining.